On a remote island in the Pacific Ocean, nearly 1,000 massive stone heads stand in silence. Most stare inland, not at the sea, not at the horizon, but at the people who carved them. Each one weighs up to 80 tons. No mortar, no cranes, no metal tools, just volcanic rock and human hands. Today we call them the Moai of Easter Island. Archaeologists say they were built to honor ancestors. Historians say they represent social hierarchy and spiritual authority. Engineers debate how they were transported. And the internet says aliens. On the mainland, in the Peruvian desert, giant animals stretch across the earth: a hummingbird, a spider, a monkey, lines that run for miles in perfect straight paths, shapes so large you can't even see them properly unless you're thousands of feet above them. We call them the Nazca Lines. Scholars say they were ritual pathways. Some say astronomical calendars. Others suggest water worship in an arid land. And yes, the internet says aliens here too. And then there's Siberia, June 30th, 1908. An explosion over the Tunguska River flattens 80 million trees. No craters left, and there is no impact site, just a shockwave that circles the globe. Scientists call it an airburst, likely a comet or asteroid exploding mid atmosphere, which makes sense. Because when 2,000 square kilometers of forest are laid down like matchsticks, it's usually not a strong gust of wind, although that would have been impressive. Three events, three different locations, three different eras, according to mainstream science. Stone heads, desert drawings, a cosmic explosion. And if you think these three mysteries have nothing in common, you're absolutely right. At least from here. Because the conventional lens sees archaeology, anthropology, and astrophysics. But what happens when we tilt the lens slightly? Not towards aliens, not towards fantasy, but towards consciousness, towards intention, toward a framework that suggests humanity may not be alone, but also not being invaded. A framework that claims the universe operates through many layers of awareness interacting carefully, subtly, without forcing belief. Tonight we're going to look at the Moai, the Nazca Lines, and the Tunguska event through the lens of the Law of One. And by the end, the real mystery may not be what happened, but why humanity keeps looking up. First, names matter, so let's respect them. What the world calls Easter Island is Rapa Nui, and the people who carved the statues there are also called the Rapa Nui. The statues themselves are moai, monolithic human figures carved primarily between roughly 1250 and 1500 AD, and the scale is not subtle. Researchers have documented hundreds upon hundreds of statues, often cited around 900 plus, with many sources putting the total near 1,000 when counting unfinished and fragmented pieces. A huge concentration remains at the main quarry, Rano Raraku, where you can still see Moai in multiple states of becoming, from barely started to almost fully freed from the bedrock. Which is archaeologists speak for, they left the workshop like someone paused the project file mid export. Most Moai were carved from volcanic tuff, compressed volcanic ash, specifically from Rano Raraku, because tuff is relatively soft and workable compared to harder basalt. The big catch: the Rapa Nui had no metal tools, so carving was done with stone implements, commonly discussed as toki, which are stone adzes, and the rock choice made the entire enterprise feasible at scale. The form is also distinctive: big heads, often noted as a huge proportion of total statue height, elongated faces, heavy brows, and simplified bodies. In conventional interpretation, these are not generic humans. They're stylized, high status, culturally specific bodies. Moai weren't just dumped around randomly. Most finished statues were transported from the quarry and placed on stone ceremonial platforms called ahu, many built along the island's perimeter. A typical ahu is not just a pedestal, it's a major cultural complex consisting of the platform and a plaza or courtyard. And excavations at some ahu have found evidence connected to mortuary practices and ritual activity. The classic question everyone asks: why do they face inland? Mainstream archaeology and art history commonly frame moai as ancestral figures, commemorations of important ancestors or leaders whose presence symbolically watch over the living community and clan lands. In other words, the moai aren't meant to be greeting ships, they're meant to be looking at you. So, yes, the vibe is protective ancestor, but also a little don't embarrass the family. So, how big are we talking? There are a few famous record holders that get cited a lot. The tallest erected moai is often identified as Paro, and it's around 10 meters tall and 82 tons. The heaviest erected example often cited is at Ahu Tongariki, reported around 86 tons. An unfinished giant at the quarry, if completed, would have been 21 meters tall and on the scale of 145 plus tons, although estimates vary. Even if you ignore the extremes, you're still left with a society repeatedly carving and moving multi ton monuments across rugged terrain. Some moai wear large red top knots called pukao, carved from red scoria, which is a different volcanic material, and associated with the quarry at Punapao. These aren't small accessories. Finished pukao are often described around 1 to 2 meters tall, 1.5 to 2.5 meters in diameter, and averaging 5 tons, with some that are even heavier. So the engineering puzzle isn't only how did they move the moai, it's also how did they lift multi ton cylinders on the top of already massive statues? Mainstream answers usually involve combinations of ramps, levering, careful staging, and coordinated labor. Nothing magical required, just a lot of planning and a lot of sore backs. The only supernatural elements is the collective decision to do this more than once. How are they transported? Well, there's a few main competing theories, and what evidence says. This is where the conventional story gets fun, because it's not one settled, everyone agrees answer. There are models, and models live or die based on archaeological traces and physics. Number one, horizontal transport, sleds, rollers, and hauling. Older popular explanations often imagine moai dragged on wooden sledges or rolled on logs. The problem is evidence. You'd expect certain kinds of track patterns, equipment traces, and large wood demand. There's also the larger debate about whether such methods imply major deforestation as a requirement. Number two, upright walking transport, rock and walk with ropes. A major modern contender, supported by experimental archaeology and recent statistical road analysis, argues that many moai were transported upright using ropes to rock them side to side, effectively walking them forward. This aligns with Rapa Nui oral tradition that the moai walked. Key evidence commonly cited in this line of work includes forward leaning posture and D shaped bases that mechanically favor controlled rocking, the nature of moai roads, and experiments where a multi ton replica was moved 100 meters in just 40 minutes using only 18 people and rope control. There's ongoing debate terrain, logistics, ropes, and whether one method fits all sizes and routes. But the walking model is increasingly argued as a strong fit for multiple lines of evidence, which means the statues didn't need aliens, they needed a good rhythm section. At first European contact, which is often cited as 1722, many moai were reportedly still standing. By the 19th century, many had been toppled. Explanations commonly point to internal conflict and social upheaval, possibly intensified by resource pressures and later compounded by catastrophic post contact impacts, including slave raids and disease that devastated the Rapa Nui population in the 19th century. In other words, the conventional story isn't just mysterious statues. It's also about a living society experiencing extreme disruption. Now we pivot. According to the Law of One material, the Moai were not originally carved by the Rapa Nui. They were not built in the 13th century, and they were not the result of primitive engineering ingenuity. They were created approximately 60,000 years ago, and they were created by what the material calls the Orion Group. Not benevolent teachers, not confused explorers, but a negatively polarized fourth density social memory complex, entities oriented towards service to self, which already reframes the story dramatically. Because in this telling, the Moai were not monuments of remembrance, they were instruments. Ross states explicitly that the Orion Group arranged certain stones in Pacific regions, including the stone heads of Easter Island and to a smaller extent in Central America. These were not symbolic hints, they were deliberate attempts at influence. And importantly, this was not part of a long, sustained intervention. It was described as a single attempt, one move on the board. A few were later created by the locals in an attempt to mimic what was already there. How were they created? Not with chisels, not with quarry ramps, not with ropes. Ross says they were constructed by thought, created at a distance, nearly all of them. No landing craft, no physical workforce, just directed consciousness forming matter. We touched on this to some extent in our pyramids episode. And if this is true, it makes the engineering debate feel slightly quaint. Did they roll them becomes a very small question. Why create massive stone heads? This is where it gets psychologically interesting. Ra explains that before creating the structures, the Orion entities scanned the deep mind, the trunk of the mind tree of the local population. They searched for images that would produce awe, not beauty, not comfort, power. Something archetypal enough to trigger a reaction in the collective psyche. And what did they choose? A giant, silent human face. Emotionless, unmoving, monolithic, the kind of face that implies watching, judging, authority, power beyond explanation. And since this Orion group is bent on spreading service to self, or negative polarity, how does awe distort towards this path? Ra's explanation is subtle. Imagine a population living at the mercy of natural forces storms, disease, hunger, earthquakes. Now introduce a structure that appears charged with nothing but power, a massive object that seems immovable, untouchable, and eternal. If an individual begins to believe that this power can be accessed, or controlled, or aligned with, then the distortion begins. Because instead of seeking harmony with others, the temptation becomes, how do I gain power over others? The statue becomes a symbol not of unity, but of dominance. Power over nature, power over people, power over fate. The Moai doesn't force belief, it doesn't command obedience. It simply sits there, radiating the suggestion that power exists and that someone might wield it. That is enough. Now, pause for a second, because whether one believes this account or not, the Law of One is not claiming aliens built everything. It is claiming something more precise, that an external group attempted to introduce the concept of power, that they did so subtly, through awe, through symbol, through image. And according to the text, it didn't work. No harvestable negative polarity emerged from that attempt. We'll get into what the harvest is in a future episode. The statues remained, but the distortion did not take root deeply enough, which may be the strangest part of the story. Not that they were created by thought, but that humanity didn't fully bite. And to me, that gives so much hope. The information did not fall upon the ears of any who were concerned to follow the negative path to polarity. Now we go to southern Peru in one of the driest places on Earth, the Nazca Desert. Here, spread across roughly 450 square kilometers of arid pampa, are thousands of lines etched directly into the surface of the earth. Not carved into rock, not built upward, but scratched into the desert floor. The lines are created by removing the top layer of dark iron oxide coated pebbles, revealing lighter soil beneath. That contrast is enough to make the designs visible from above, and because the region is so dry and windless, they've survived for nearly 2 millennia. In other words, they didn't paint them, they didn't build them, they edited the ground. Radiocarbon dating of associated materials in archaeological context places most Nazca geoglyphs between roughly 200 BC and 600 AD during the Nazca culture period, which followed the earlier Paracas culture. So we're not talking prehistoric mystery builders. We're talking about a sophisticated, agriculturally organized society with ceramics, textiles, irrigation systems, and ritual centers. This matters because the Nazca were not isolated cave dwellers looking at the sky in confusion. They were engineers. The Nazca lines are not one thing, there are thousands of things. Researchers have cataloged over 800 straight lines, around 300 geometric figures like trapezoids, triangles, spirals, and roughly 70 biomorphic figures, animals, and plants. Some of the most famous you might be familiar with include the hummingbird, the monkey, the spider, the condor, and then there are the trapezoids, massive geometric corridors stretching hundreds of meters across. Some lines run for miles in almost perfectly straight paths, with remarkable alignment consistency across uneven terrain, which raises the obvious question: how do you draw a straight line across a desert without seeing it from above? Answer: surprisingly simple surveying techniques. Archaeologists have demonstrated that with wooden stakes, rope, and basic geometry, large geoglyphs can be laid out accurately without aerial access. No hot air balloons required. Although that theory had a brief moment in the 1970s, because of course it did. The big question: why make something you can't see? This is where conventional scholarship diverges into several overlapping interpretations. Number one, ritual pathways. Excavations show that some lines were walked. There is evidence of foot traffic. Ceramic fragments have been found near certain figures. This has led to the idea that some lines were ritual processional pathways, sacred routes tied to ceremonies, meaning they weren't meant to be viewed from above, they were meant to be experienced from within. You walk the line, you embody the symbol. Number two, water and fertility rituals. The Nazca lived in an extremely dry environment. Water was survival. Archaeologists have found sophisticated underground aqueduct systems called paquillos, still partially functional today. Some scholars propose that the lines were tied to water worship, possibly marking underground water sources or serving as offerings to deities associated with rain and fertility. In this view, the giant hummingbird isn't an airstrip, it's a prayer. Number three, astronomical alignments. In the mid 20th century, mathematician and researcher Maria Ricci famously argued that many lines corresponded to celestial events, solstices, star risings, and planetary movements. Later research has been more cautious. While some alignments exist, large scale statistical analyses suggest that many lines do not correspond precisely enough to serve as a consistent astronomical calendar. So the astronomy theory isn't dead, but it's also not universally accepted. Now let's move on to the construction methods. No mystery required. Unlike the Moai, the Nazca Lines do not require superhuman engineering. The desert's natural surface layer makes the work surprisingly efficient. By removing a few inches of darker stones, workers expose lighter sediment underneath. The contrast remains visible for centuries because the region receives less than an inch of rain annually, there's minimal erosion, and there's little vegetation growth. In short, nature did most of the preservation work. What looks supernatural from the sky is, on the ground, a matter of organization and labor. So, what are we left with? A culture that understood geometry, engineered irrigation, practiced ritual procession, embedded symbolism into the landscape, and may have tied cosmology, survival, and ceremony together. The Nazca Lines are not a single message, they are a system, a network of meaning carved into the earth itself. And like the Moai, they raise a strange tension. They're massive, they're deliberate, they endure, but their ultimate intention remains debated. From the conventional lens, this is anthropology, ritual behavior, environmental adaptation, symbolic expression. Nothing supernatural required, just humans drawing on the earth. Now, we tilt the lens again. According to the law of one material, the Nazca formations were not created between 200 BC and 600 AD. They were not purely Nazca cultural artifacts, and they were not primarily ritual walkways. Ra places their origin at approximately 60,000 years ago, the same period referenced in the discussion of the Moai, the same early cycle of third density humanity. And though Ra does not repeat the words Orion group in the Nazca exchange directly, the context is continuous, the same discussion of negatively oriented intervention. The implication is clear. The Nazca formations were part of the same Orion attempt. Ra states the time frame for the creation of the lines clearly, approximately 60,000 years ago, which means, if taken literally, the formations predate the Nazca culture by tens of thousands of years. What we see today, in this interpretation, are not the original designs in their fullness. They are remnants, eroded outlines, faint traces. But how could lines only visible from the sky benefit anyone walking on the surface? This is where the Law of One offers something unexpected. The Nazca region was not always the flat, open desert we see today. Ra explains that at the time of their creation, the area was structured with hills overlooking the formations. The earth itself was more dramatically contoured. The smoothness we see now is the result of tens of thousands of years of light wind and erosion. In that earlier landscape, the formations were visible from elevated vantage points, not from aircraft, from hills, which reframes the entire only visible from above argument. It wasn't about signaling the sky, it was about being seen from perspective, from elevation, from those who climbed. The purpose of the Nazca Lines mirrors that of the Moai. Ra describes the formations as being charged with energy of power, not charged with knowledge, not charged with harmony, power. The same polarity distortion, the same psychological mechanism. Imagine a group of early humans climbing a hill and seeing, laid out across the earth, massive geometric design, ordered, deliberate, too large to comprehend from within. structures that imply intention beyond their own scale. But this time, not through monolithic faces watching you, through patterns that dwarf you. The suggestion becomes there is power here. Something shaped this land, something capable of altering Earth itself. And if power can reshape the ground, perhaps power can reshape people. The distortion towards service to self does not require explicit instruction. It only requires the idea that power exists externally and might be accessed. And what are we left with now? According to Ra, what we see today are faint traces of what once were formidable structures. The hills have softened, the earth has eroded, the desert has flattened. What were once powerful structural designs visible from elevation are now ghostly lines etched into sand, which creates a strange inversion. Modern archaeology sees primitive ritual art. The Law of One sees the fossilized footprint of a failed attempt at negative influence. And either way, what remains are outlines, faint geometry, a suggestion of something larger that once was. And here again, the same ending as with the Moai. Ross says the attempt did not produce harvestable negative polarity. The structures endured, the distortion did not fully take root, which leaves us with something oddly poetic. Two separate locations, two monumental gestures, both allegedly created to inspire awe and distort toward power, both still standing or etched, and yet humanity did not tip. June 30th, 1908, 7:14 in the morning. A fireball streaks across the Siberian sky. Moments later, an explosion flattens approximately 2,000 square kilometers of forest near the Tunguska River. An estimated 80 million trees are knocked down. No crater is found, no impact site, just radial devastation. Imagine standing in a forest and watching the trees fall outward in perfect symmetry, like matchsticks pushed down by an invisible hand. That is Tunguska. Modern estimates place the blast energy somewhere between 10 to 15 megatons of TNT. For comparison, the Hiroshima bomb was 15 kilotons. Tunguska, potentially 1,000 times stronger. And yet, no confirmed human fatalities. The region was sparsely populated, which is the only reason Tunguska isn't remembered as one of the deadliest disasters in recorded history. It happened in the right place. If you're going to have a 10 megaton explosion, Siberia is a convenient option. The leading scientific explanation for the cause is an airburst event, a comet or stony asteroid, likely between 50 and 60 meters in diameter, entered Earth's atmosphere at high speed. Instead of striking the ground, it disintegrated midair due to extreme pressure and heat. The object exploded at an altitude estimated between 5 and 10 kilometers. This created a massive shockwave, thermal radiation, seismic activity detectable thousands of kilometers away, and atmospheric pressure waves that circled the planet. Witnesses describe a column of fire splitting the sky. Heat so intense it felt like their shirts were burning, a thunderclap that knocked people off their feet, windows shattered hundreds of kilometers away. For days afterwards, strange atmospheric events occurred across Europe and Asia. Night skies glowed. People reportedly read newspapers at midnight without artificial light. This was likely caused by high altitude dust reflecting sunlight. A reminder that even an explosion in remote Siberia can ripple globally. Why was there no crater? Because it never hit the ground. Unlike the Chicxulub impact that ended the dinosaurs, Tunguska was a detonation in the atmosphere. The energy was released downward and outward, flattening trees but leaving no impact bowl. The pattern of tree fall supports this. Trees directly beneath the explosion were scorched but still standing, and trees farther out were knocked down in radial pattern. It wasn't an impact punch, it was an aerial shockwave hammer. Tunguska is the largest recorded impact event in modern human history. It proves something unsettling. Objects large enough to devastate cities can enter Earth's atmosphere without warning. In 1908, there were no telescopic detection networks, no planetary defense systems, no early warning radar. The sky simply did what it does. It delivered something. The first major scientific expedition didn't reach the site until 1927, led by Leonid Kulik. He expected to find a crater. He found none. Instead, he found miles of flattened forest. Subsequent expeditions throughout the 20th century confirmed the airburst model through tree analysis, soil sampling, and atmospheric modeling. Even today, Tunguska remains a reference case for planetary defense research. It is studied as a scenario. What happens if this occurs over London, over New York, over Tokyo? The answer is uncomfortable. And what are we left with here? From the conventional lens, Tunguska is physics, astrophysics, orbital mechanics, atmospheric dynamics, no gods, no intent, just a cosmic object intersecting Earth's path at precisely the wrong time, or the right time, depending on geography. A random collision in a universe that doesn't ask permission. That is the scientific framing, a fluke, a natural event, a reminder that Earth exists inside a larger celestial system, nothing more. Now, according to the law of one material, Tunguska was not an asteroid. It was not a comet. It was not a random celestial collision. It was a malfunction. Specifically, the destruction of a small fission reactor. And that reactor powered what Ra describes as a drone sent by the Confederation, not Orion, the Confederation. The same positively oriented group described elsewhere as attempting to aid humanity without infringing on free will, which already creates tension because now we're not dealing with cosmic randomness, we're dealing with oversight. Ra describes the drone as a listening device, a monitoring probe. By 1908, humanity was entering what Ra calls a more technical sphere: industrialization, electromagnetic experimentation, wireless transmission, radio. The Confederation was interested in determining the extent and the rapidity of technological advancement, so they sent a drone powered by what Ra calls a simple fission motor, not identical to modern nuclear reactors, probably simply because of its small size, but based on the same fundamental principle: a compact energy source, advanced, efficient, and if compromised, destructive. So what happened? It malfunctioned. And instead of attempting retrieval, which Ra describes as having very low probability of success, the Confederation made a decision. They moved it to an isolated location and detonated it. Siberia, 1908. A place with minimal population density, minimal chance of mass casualty, minimal chance of clear observation. Besides the obvious of not wishing to cause mass death, why move it to such a remote location? This is where the law of one concept of free will becomes central. In this framework, overt displays of advanced technology, especially something unmistakably non human, risk infringing upon humanity's developmental trajectory. If a clear extraterrestrial craft had been seen, if undeniable debris had been recovered, if direct evidence of off planet intelligence had entered public awareness in 1908, human free will in this philosophy would have been distorted. Belief would not arise organically, it would be forced by spectacle, and forced awareness is considered infringement. So the drone was moved to an area where its destruction would not meaningfully alter humanity's belief systems. The event would remain explainable, debatable, absorbable into conventional science, which it did. It became an airburst, a natural phenomenon, a fluke, and humanity's developmental arc remained intact. Ra clarifies something subtle. There was radiation, but highly localized, not the kind that drifts with winds like early nuclear weapons. Tree studies in the region have detected low radiation anomalies. In the law of one framing, this aligns with the drone's small fission source. Powerful energy release, limited long term contamination, a controlled disaster, if such a phrase can exist. With the Moai and Nazca, the Orion Group blatantly introduced distortion towards power, without much consideration of keeping the locals' free will intact. With Tunguska, the Confederation accidentally introduced a display of power, and then carefully contained it. One group's attempts sometimes direct influence through awe, the other attempts non interference through concealment. And in both cases, humanity remained largely unaware, which leaves us with an unsettling possibility. Two ancient locales, allegedly having structures built to shape the polarity of the peoples by negative intent. One modern explosion, allegedly caused by positive oversight. All largely hidden beneath conventional explanation. Not erased, just explainable enough. Three locations, two ancient, one modern. In the law of one framing, the Moai and the Nazca formations were attempts to influence humanity, not through violence, not through domination, but through awe. Awe at something larger, something seemingly beyond human scale. A silent suggestion that power exists, and perhaps you can align with it, wield it, or become it. But it was influence without consent, an introduction of distortion, a gentle nudge towards hierarchy, towards power over others, towards separation. And according to the material, it didn't take. Not deeply enough. Humanity did what humanity does. We adapted the symbols, we reinterpreted them, we built stories around them, but we did not tip fully into the intended polarity. And then, thousands of years later, a device sent by a positively oriented confederation malfunctions. And what do? They move it away from people. They detonate it where it won't be clearly seen. They allow it to be explained as a meteor. Why? Because in this philosophy, growth must be chosen, not imposed. Belief must emerge internally, not from spectacle. The difference between the two interventions isn't power. Both demonstrate power. The difference is permission. One attempts to introduce influence through overwhelming symbol. The other attempts to avoid influence altogether. And maybe that's the real lens shift here. Because whether or not one accepts the law of one as literal history, there is something deeply human in this pattern. We are constantly confronted with power: political power, technological power, cultural power, mythic power. Some of it tries to shape us, some of it tries not to. Some of it is accidental, some is intentional. The question isn't whether power exists, it clearly does. The question is, do we respond by trying to control others with it, or by choosing how we evolve in its presence? Maybe the Moai, the Nazca Lines, and Tunguska aren't really about aliens. Maybe they're about polarity, about how we react when faced with something bigger than us. Do we reach upward in humility or reach outward for dominance? And maybe the most interesting detail in all three stories is this: humanity was not forced, not 60,000 years ago, not in 1908. We were influenced, we were observed, we were brushed by something larger, but the choice remained ours, and it still does. Thank you for watching or listening. I wish you all love, light, peace, and joy. Take care.